make a start. Welcome along to this evening's talk, which is the last of our 2025 session. For anyone that missed the launch of the latest publication, which was last week, paid up members, please collect your copy if you haven't done so already. And they're also for sale for anyone that's not a member. I'm delighted to reintroduce Dr John Reid. John is chair of Trimontium Trust and a recently retired NHS Consultant who specialises in diseases of the heart and lungs. He has led on a wide variety of archaeological projects, including the use of radiology and archaeology, facial reconstruction, and the use of wide area metal prospection for advancing the understanding of ancient conflict. He has also led the award-winning multi-million-pound redevelopment of Trimontium Museum in Melrose, the only museum in Scotland to focus on the Roman Iron Age. Dr Reid's work has been recognised by the King in his first birthday honours list with an MBE for Culture and Heritage. So if I could ask you to join me in welcoming Dr
Reid. Microphone's fallen off. Not auspicious. Can you hear me? Yep, that's good. Yeah. I'll just rejig this. Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you to the Society again for allowing me to come along and talk about my second favourite subject after the thoracic aorta. It's also nice to see Roddy Cameron in the audience again. Roddy was one of my colleagues from the Royal Infirmary, and we share many tales that I'm sure would be better not shared among the general public. So tonight I want to talk about the Souterrains of Angus. There are a number of reasons for choosing that particular topic, not least because it's one which is probably dear to many of your hearts, but also in our future work at Trimontium, we hope and intend to build a replica souterrain that we can use for experimental archaeology. And so we've become very interested in souterrains. There was a souterrain quite close to Trimontium, and probably utilised some of the Roman building materials from the fort, and I'll talk a bit more about the reuse of stone as we go along. My talk was a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. This is what Churchill said in 1939 about Russia, and nothing has changed. We have moved quite away with souterrain studies, and there have been some excellent excavations in the last 20-25 years, but we still have a number of question marks hanging over these enigmatic structures, and I hope to explore some of that with you as we go along. As usual, there is a disclaimer at the start of all my lectures. I am not an archaeologist, and I work very closely with some fantastic colleagues and admire their work deeply. But the target of my expertise has always been the heart and lungs, going back quite some time, the last 40 years. Trained in Glasgow, moved to Edinburgh, trained in Edinburgh, then Stockholm, then down to the Scottish borders, and a short time at the United Nations in Vienna, working for the International Atomic Energy Agency. So I've been around the piece, but I have to say I keep coming back to Scotland's Iron Age because it's absolutely fascinating. I've been chair of Trimontium Trust now for 30 years, which is a lot longer than the 4 years that the Constitution allows. And that's because every time I step down, nobody else wants to step up. So I've just kept going, but I have to say I'm getting to the point now where I really do need to step down. We have spent a lot of time in the last 4 or 5 years renovating the museum, and I spoke a bit about that the last time, and you'd all be welcome to come and see. We now have a new virtual reality experience where you can go inside the museum, inside the Roman fort in the virtual world. And we also have a virtual experience of the Burnswark siege site as well, which I find particularly exciting. So we've got a lot going on at the museum, we've just recently managed to obtain a 25-year lease on the Roman fort site at Trimontium. So we're hoping to move the archaeology of that site on a bit over the next few years. So that's enough about me. What is a souterrain? Well, it's by its very name is a subterranean passage or chamber. And I'm conscious that there are quite a few folk in this room who will know a lot more about this than I do. But I hope I will pull up some of the interesting points that we might discuss at the end. These structures may be discovered in isolation, but they're often associated with some Iron Age settlement nearby or actually within the settlement itself. It's a phenomenon associated with the European Atlantic Iron Age, and it's particularly, these structures are particularly prevalent in Scotland and Ireland, but also in Cornwall and Brittany, and I'll say a bit about that in a second. But we have, and you have, a very important concentration of these in Angus and in eastern Perthshire. And this is a sort of cartoon of what a souterrain construction might look like. A single thickness wall of rough stone, dry stone walling, and then corbelling or potential corbelling over part of it, and then roofing slabs to finish off the superstructure. Now, for a long time I thought these structures must have been entirely subterranean, and some of them are. If you go and visit Culsh, you'll see it is entirely subterranean. But I think the thinking is now that these will be visible, a lot of these will have been visible from the surface, and that is that they would not have been a hidden structure as such, a very intentional structure, similar to the other structures that were being used within the Roundhouse settlement. This is Ardesti, and it shows quite nicely the relationship here to a settlement. There's the base of a roundhouse and a couple of subsidiary structures leading to the entrance of the souterrain. And the souterrain produces this nice C-shaped curve and very often has a rounded or a bulbous end at the blind end of the passageway. But as I said, there are other souterrains, and they have slightly different chronologies from the souterrains that we're going to talk about tonight. There are the Cornish fogus, which are well known. These tend to be slightly smaller and slightly more constricted than the Angus souterrains. One of the interesting features that they have is this thing here called a creep, which funnels anybody who's in the souterrain almost onto their hands and knees to get through into another portion of the souterrain. The dating of these is middle of the first millennium BC is when these start. So these tend to appear to be a bit earlier than the souterrains in Angus, which start round about 100 BC and go through to 4th or 5th century AD. So they tend to be older and tend to be slightly more constricted. Then there are Irish souterrains, and there's quite a number of these, tend to be straighter and again tend to be slightly smaller in height than the Angus souterrains, and these appear to date from a slightly later period. These appear to have their floruit in the early medieval period and being used and recorded as being used right through to the 8th and 9th centuries. So they again tend to be slightly different both in structure and also in their usage. The souterrains keep being found in Scotland. This was one found not that long ago at Knockard, and Lewis, my wife, is from this part of the island. She has a broch at the bottom of her family croft, and I'm just hoping one of these days one of the tractors will go through the roof of a souterrain and we'll have a souterrain as well as broch on the croft. You can see the roofing slabs, you can see the rounded end of this. It's relatively short and again slightly more constricted than the Angus souterrains. Now, AOC Archaeology did a very nice laser scan of the interior of this particular souterrain at Crackney in Sutherland, and the green area is the interior of the souterrain. And you can see that it shows one of the interesting features of nearly all souterrains, in that they have a relatively constricted entrance. It's not a wide entrance, funneling to a narrow base. It's a narrow entrance funneling to a significantly wider base, and that tends to follow through with most of the souterrains in the Angus area. You can see there's a sort of unusual step down into the opening there, and it's almost a crawl space before you get into it. This is the souterrain not far from here at Teeling, and it's quite nice. It shows this very distinctive C-shaped curve that most of the Angus souterrains have, or at least they have a part of the souterrain that has this C-shaped curve. And the entrance point is to the right. Again, a relatively constricted entrance point with door jambs. In this case, a lot of the Angus souterrains do have door jambs at their entrance. And then, if I just play that back again, if I can. Yep, you'll see that there is the bulbous end at the blind end of the souterrain. My wife always gets made walk in structures for scale. She absolutely hates it. So if you ever go out with me for a walk, you'll be put in a ditch or put on top of some sort of mound for scale. Now, the distribution of souterrains in Scotland, you can see they tend to have a coastal distribution, but then so too do many of the Iron Age structures. But the density, the big density, is in the Fife Peninsula and the Angus area. And when you zoom down in on that, you can see that this county is absolutely heaving with souterrains. Now, it used to be thought that there were probably about 30, 40 souterrains in the county. There are now well over 200, recognised from aerial photography and also from excavation. Now, most of you, hopefully, will know who this is. This is Frederick Wainwright, who was, if you like, the father of souterrain studies. He should be familiar to you all because your society funded his work for a few years. He was a lecturer at the University College of Dundee and then went on to be the head of early medieval studies, in those days called Dark Age Studies at St Andrews University. Sadly, he died at a young age with cerebral aneurysm. He was only 44, died in 1961, and his wife went on to make sure that his work was published in this, which was a seminal book on souterrains. It really started the whole course of souterrain studies for Scotland, and it's still a very readable book. I've got a copy. It's well thumbed. It's fallen apart, but it's a book that's well worth reading. And Wainwright decided to kind of sweep away a lot of the folklore about souterrains and really explore what their purpose might be. And he considered lots of different possibilities here. The first was habitation, and for a long time souterrains were thought, in the Victorian period, were thought to be the homes or houses of a dwarf race that lived in the north of Scotland. And then that kind of transmogrified into being Pictish houses, and then the Picts somehow became dwarfs as well. So we had this weird conflation of the size of the houses with the size of the structures with the potential height of the individuals. But he pretty well dismissed that right at the outset. They were for a long time thought to be refuges in time of conflict. The fact that many of them will have been visible to the naked eye above ground surface would have made that very doubtful, although there is definite evidence from the literature of the Irish souterrains being used as bolt holes. So we know that they were the Irish ones from the literature from the 8th and 9th centuries described these structures being used as refuges. But I and Wainwright had his doubts about that right from the outset. Now, like everything from the Iron Age, it's suspected of having a ritual focus. Part of that is to do with some of the reuse of the stonework within the souterrains, and I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. But I think people have tended to move away from that as being the sole purpose or the primary purpose of these structures. I mean, there's probably nothing that happened in the Iron Age that did not have a ritual connection. In fact, I'm old enough now to remember my grandmother doing nothing that didn't have some religious connection. So the idea that in the Iron Age that there would have been some religious connotation to either the stonework or the orientation or the shape or whatever is probably a reasonable association, but not the primary purpose for these structures. And finally, and probably more credibly, that they're seen as some sort of agricultural structure. Now, Wainwright came off the fence. He wrote a whole chapter on what he thought. He put his money where his mouth was, and he came off the fence and said unequivocally it was an animal shelter. And there were lots of reasons why he thought that, mainly because of the blocking, the side arms being partially blocked and animals not being able to get over that. And he felt very strongly that they were designed for cattle. And not all souterrains, but the Angus souterrains specifically, because he said they were large enough, they were tall enough and wide enough to act as animal shelters. Now, I'm fortunate, my wife is not only from the Outer Hebrides, her brother is the Gaelic television vet. And anything to do with large animals, I speak to him about. He deals all the time with cows. And I asked Alistair, do you think these could have been used? And I sent him some plans. And he said, absolutely not. You could not keep cows in the dark, in single file, in something that's 30 metres long. They just wouldn't stand there. They would probably kill each other and they would kill you if you went into the space with them. And he said, even if they didn't do that, their urine produces so much ammonia, it stops the cilia of their lungs working, and they would all die relatively quickly with pneumonia. So there are multiple reasons why I don't think, and most people now don't think, that they were used as animal shelters. One of the issues was that in the two souterrains that he spent a lot of time at, Ardesti and Carlungi, there were a lot of teeth, bovine teeth, in the excavation material from the floor of the souterrain. But teeth have been found in virtually all of the souterrains, and it's now thought that they're sweepings from the rest of the site being put into the souterrain when the souterrain is being backfilled. I'll come to the whole phenomenon of backfilling in a second. More recently, I think it's been accepted now that for the storage of agricultural surplus and the fairly constant cool conditions, if you think about your Roquefort cheese is almost entirely created in caves and in dark and damp holes in France. And that's true of quite a lot of dairy products can be kept in those conditions for quite a long time. And so too can smoked meats. So probably dairy produce and meat. And there's still quite a strong contingent favour them being used as grain storage. And interestingly, there is relatively little in the way of grain found in the excavated souterrains. One or two have had some grain, but it's been felt that that grain has been washed in from the rest of the site or subsequently placed there by people who have reused the souterrain after it has been destroyed. So that's the sort of line of thinking that that Wainwright took, and he dispelled this thing that had gone around. David McRitchie, who was also a very active Victorian genealogist and racial commentator, wrote a couple of books on the racial origins of the Britons, trying to refute the Aryan supremacy, tall, blonde, Saxon philosophy that was going around at the time. And so he tried to portray the Northern Scots as being dwarf and dark-skinned. And of course, for those of you who have seen any of the photographs from Covesea Cave, there were for a time Romany people staying in the cave who were relatively short and pretty dark-skinned. And that to him just simply confirmed that these were the ancestors of the Picts. The progenitors, the descendants of the Picts. Wainwright started mapping the souterrain shapes, and it became clear that they tended to have this striking curvilinear shape, and there's no explanation forthcoming for why that should be, and that is often used as one of the sort of ritual elements to these, but you can see that they don't follow a clockwise or a counterclockwise direction. And some of them are pretty large. Hands up who's been to Pitcairn. It's huge, absolutely huge. It's 60 metres long. Unbelievable. And when in its heyday, when it was fully roofed, it must have been something pretty special. But you would have been running out of candles by the time you got to the end of it. And anything down there would have been in the pitch dark. Absolute darkness. It's like the inside of broths. Broths must have had some lighting in them. You cannot have a structure that's used for habitation going on for hundreds of years that is in absolute pitch darkness all the time. So there has to be some way that these were lit. And it's not unusual for archaeologists to find at the entranceways fragments of stone lamps or tallow bowls for holding some sort of light. Now this is Carlungi, and you can see that Carlungi shows nicely these side arms, these side chambers, which are often very constricted compared to the main passageway. And the entrance into them is often very tight. You can just squeeze through them, but it's not easy. It's not easy to do. And again, that was one of the reasons why Wainwright thought that these were areas that younger animals would have been put into and then penned in. I'm not entirely clear why they have them, other than the fact that they're simply extending the real estate of the souterrain for further storage. Now, from the outset, objects have been found in the excavated material from the souterrains, and most of it tends to be related to the indigenous population. There will be often indigenous coarse pottery, and then some smaller objects that were pretty common on any indigenous roundhouse site. Beads, the odd bronze object, bangles, tweezers in this particular case, and little bits of pottery. Now, often there's a bit of conflation sometimes between material that's found on the adjacent site and material that's found in the souterrain. And the souterrains themselves often don't have much material culture within them. One or two do, but most have got tiny, tiny fragments. And here at Hurley-Hawken, most of the interesting material is not coming from the souterrain, but is actually coming from the adjacent broch. And all of you will be aware of the relatively high incidence of Roman material coming from the more southerly brochs, so that's not really a surprise. Now, things moved forward considerably with this paper by Ian Armitt in 1999 that appeared in the Proceedings of the Society of Antiquaries. And Ian had picked up on something that Wainwright had already identified. Wainwright identified that the souterrains go out of use. Something happens, and the souterrains are no longer being used, but the settlement to which they're attached is still operational. So he realised that there was a mismatch between the longevity of the souterrain compared to the adjacent roundhouses. Now, some of his connections and associations have been queried, but I think it still holds reasonably true that the souterrains tend to stop functioning as souterrains round about the 3rd century AD. And Ian Armitt picked up on this. Have you had Ian Armitt to lecture to you in the past? No. What Ian doesn't know about the Iron Age isn't really worth knowing, to be honest. And he's currently the Professor of Archaeology at York University. And he's written extensively on the Iron Age and the Late Bronze Age. And he mapped out the souterrains, and he formulated a hypothesis that the souterrains hadn't just been abandoned or degenerated as Wainwright had thought. He saw that the souterrains, looking at the material culture and what radiocarbon dates there were, he saw that the souterrains could have all, and we're talking about the Angus souterrains here, that the Angus souterrains could have been abandoned during a single event. And that single event may not be, literally a matter of a couple of weeks, but related to an action. In his case, in Ian Armitt's idea, it was the actions of the Roman army. We'll come back to that as we go on. But he saw that there was something strange had happened here. But that wasn't all that he did. He looked at the southern souterrains, and there's a small group of southern souterrains, and he pointed out, and I don't know why I missed this, but he pointed out that there were no souterrains at all in the lands of the Votadini, who were doing business with the Romans. And if you superimpose the settlements on the potential souterrains, as far as I know, and you may be able to correct me, I don't think there's a single souterrain at all from this part of East Lothian. When you superimpose the settlement pattern, you can see that the area is absolutely heaving with Iron Age agricultural sites. And clearly these people are not using souterrains to store their agricultural surplus. We also know that these people are also doing business with the Romans, because the Roman material culture from this area is completely different from elsewhere in Scotland, and we also know that there is not a single Roman fort or Roman campaign camp anywhere within 50 miles of Trimontium law. So the Romans don't do that for nothing. As soon as they find a power centre, they move in. So whoever was at Trimontium and inhabiting this area was dealing with Rome, but dealing with Rome in a different way from the rest of the country. And he compared the finds from the Angus souterrains and the construction techniques of the Angus souterrains to this southern group. And I'll come back to the southern group in a second. In his conclusion, he saw that there was an approximation of the high density of souterrains in this area with the high density of Roman campaign camps of the Severan period, or at least the late Antonine into the Severan period. And he felt that this relationship had to mean something. I think it probably does mean something, but I don't necessarily agree with Ian's conclusions on that. So he called it evolution. Were these souterrains simply evolving out of use, or were they catastrophically destroyed, or was the population dislocated? Was the population moved out? And I think there's now increasing evidence, certainly from the work that Gordon Noble is doing at Tapa North, that there is a huge boost to the population on that site in the 3rd century, and it looks very like, certainly with the current zeitgeist, it certainly looks like an influx of refugees are coming to the northeast to get away from the Severian backlash. So, if we look at the potential reasons for abandonment, Wainwright felt that there was a strong case for structural failure. He showed that there was evidence of drainage problems with Ardesti and some wall collapse at Carlungi, and he felt that these souterrains were going out of use simply because they had outlived their architectural lifespan, and that he identified what he thought was a post-souterrain society in these roundhouse settlements after the roundhouses had been after the souterrains had been abandoned. Watkins published extensively in the 80s and 90s, and he drew attention to the fact that there may have been a shift in the structure of society at the time that could explain it, because he felt that the souterrains, and the souterrains were relatively small in number at that point when he formulated his theory about changes to the indigenous society. So he felt souterrains were elite structures belonging to elite groups. At that point, not enough souterrains had been discovered to tell him that actually any roundhouse settlement worth its salt has to have at least one souterrain. And some roundhouse settlements have got 2, 3 and 4 souterrains. So far from being an elite structure owned by the hierarchy of that particular tribe or grouping of indigenous people, they're much more common than that. But he felt as the Pictish development, as the Picts began to move further south and to create an overlordship that would deal a death blow to these local hierarchies that would dole out grain or whatever agricultural produce from their souterrain. So in his view, it was to do with the changing shape of the control of the basic needs of communities. And whenever it became a pan-Scottish tribe or power base of Pictland, these smaller units fell out of use. Now, Ian Armitt could see the merit in that, but felt that it was more likely to be the elephant in the room. And the elephant in the room is the superpower of Rome marching backwards and forwards across exactly this territory at exactly the same time as these souterrains are starting to go out of use. And he postulated 3 potential changes. One was warfare, out and out, open warfare, as in genocidal warfare. And that would have caused loss of the agricultural society that would sustain these souterrains. And they may have become refugees, and in the time that they had before they're driven from their homesteads, willfully destroyed the homes, the souterrains themselves, so that they couldn't be used by others, particularly the invading Roman state. The other possibility was that the Roman army brought plague, and I think that's not an unreasonable suggestion. Plagues, and we know the Antonine plague killed about 25% of people in the Roman Empire during the reign of Marcus Aurelius. And there's a reasonable chance that the relatively secluded nations in this cul-de-sac island would be exposed, rather like the American indigenous population being exposed to the white settlers moving west. And that plague may have completely decimated societies in the south and the mid and south part of Scotland. So he suggested those potential theories, but he came down on the final one, which was loss of trade with the Roman army. Because he's right, these souterrains, when they were in full use, must have produced thousands of tons of surplus. There are so many of them, and they're so large compared to other souterrains, that there seems to be an over-provision of storage. And in his mind, he saw this potentially being trade with the Roman army. That is, the Roman army would barter with the local population, because there's no coin economy, would barter with the local population, and the Roman army would benefit from its vast requirements for grain. Now, two things have happened in the last 20 years. We now realise that the Roman army, it used to be thought that the Roman army was vegetarian. That is definitely not the case. The Roman army loves its steak, and beef is a big, big issue for the Roman army. So grain would have been important, but not the only story. And the other thing is, the Roman army, we know this from reading Josephus, the Roman army, when they pull into town and they want something, they don't give you money for it. They just tell you they won't kill you, is the bottom line, and then they take it. And then they keep taking it. So, and that is probably closer to the truth, because for the thousands of tons that these souterrains must have produced, a couple of broken cups, which is all that's left, you can put all of the Roman material from all of the souterrains into a shoebox. Now that's not really trade by any sort of normal standards. And if you look at trade at other places where we definitely know the Romans were trading, material culture leaks into the society in a much more emphatic way than the material does that's coming from the souterrain sites. So I think loss of trade is a reasonable suggestion, but I don't think that's the main cause. I actually think it's a mixture of a couple of things. I think that there is some major event takes place, probably disease and backed with warfare, and some exodus of the local population. I think also that there's an evolution in storage practices. And just through these. This was Wainwright's suggestion, the spread of the Pictish overlordship, reducing the influence of local elites. If you look at the material that comes from the souterrain sites, this is, I think, up to date. There may be one or two additions to this, but it's things like an amphora bung, an amphora sherd, or a Samian sherd. Now these Samian sherds sometimes are the size of your fingernail, and that's not a very big reward for half a ton of grain or 10 cows. So we're not looking at a dynamic trading partnership here. All we're seeing is the sort of almost radioactive nature of having a superpower anywhere close, because tiny little fragments of that superpower stick to the indigenous population. And so how do we explain the residual material, Roman material culture? Is it trade? I absolutely don't think so. Fraser Hunter would not agree with me. Fraser likes to see the Romans doing business with everybody. But that business is obviously pretty paltry, in my view. Is it scavenging? I suspect there is a significant amount of picking over the remains once the Roman army has left. Is it bribery to keep the peace? Well, we certainly know they're giving coin in a big way to keep the peace. They're giving sacks of silver coins, and they're found all over the mid and south of Scotland. I think there are about 40 hoards so far discovered, and hoards have been found every 4 or 5 years. So the Romans are bribing the locals to keep the peace, and certainly the local warlords. Is it booty? Is it the result of warfare where the indigenous people are taking material? I don't think so. I think there are other examples of booty in the south of Scotland, but the material in the Souterrains I don't think is booty. And the final one is one that I put in, is it talismanic? Do the people of the Iron Age settlements that come into contact with Rome, either by direct conflict or know of the conflicts that are going on elsewhere, collect tiny little bits of Roman material? Now, this is a shed in Afghanistan. It's in Kabul, and all of this stuff has been picked up, has been scavenged from American military sites. None of this is weaponry. They've scavenged a whole lot of weaponry as well. This is just odds and ends that have been picked up, and quite clearly, this is not from trade. We know that this isn't trade that's going on, but there is a black market subsequently in material that does get picked up. Talismanic is something that I think we should consider. This is a box that I inherited from my father, and these are bits of shrapnel from German bombs that he collected in Clydebank. And he gathered these quite religiously, and most of the other kids did too. And I asked him subsequently why he did this. Why did he collect these? And it had to be German. It wasn't interested in the ack shells of the Brits shooting at the Germans. He was only interested in German material. And he didn't really know, and we had conversations about this throughout his life, and I acquired his box of goodies. And subsequently we kind of talked about it, and we came to the conclusion that he felt as a scared child or a scared teenager, because they were being bombed on a regular basis, that he had some control over his fate if he could have tiny sherds of the people who were trying to kill him. And he kept them in a little box and he preserved them. And I often wonder if some of these tiny little bits of Romanelia that get into sites are from this sort of collecting because of the consciousness of threat of the indigenous population. And if you look at the distribution of Roman sites, in the first surge into the country, they come right up through Angus and head at least as far as Stracathro and probably go up round the mounts and up into Murrayshire. And this area would have at least probably 4 or 5 forts within easy reach of Roman cavalry squadrons. So it would have been well policed, and that's in the first invasion period. In the second invasion period, between the 140s and the 180s, I put this in for a bit of a tongue-in-cheek. This, of course, is Commodus, and it was during Commodus's reign that a major rebellion takes place in 180 or 184 AD, and that has a serious backlash. And we know that historically because it's recorded by Cassius Dio. He sends Ulpius Marcellus, who was not to be messed with. He was a lethal Roman general who spent a few months stomping around, killing everything that he could get his hands on to regain order after the revolt of 184. So the Antonine period wasn't without its problems as well, and that's the period that Ian Arnott sees as being the big period of trade with the ensconced Roman army, whose frontier effectively is his frontier is the Antonine Wall. But you can see the positioning of Stregeath, Ardach and Bertha is to create a peninsula, is to hive off Fife. Fife has certainly been taken as an area that the Romans are going to protect from anybody else pinching their stuff. And then we come to the Souterrain assault, and it goes on for 2.5 years, probably 3 years, and it has Caracalla stomping about with a massive army, probably about 40,000 men. And if you believe again Cassius Dio, Caracalla is told to kill everybody that he can get his hands on in that time period. So there was obviously a lot going on in this neck of the woods for about nearly 150 years. And that's quite a considerable period of military and conflict turmoil. So a lot will have been happening to the indigenous population and potentially disturbing the whole flow of the agricultural cycle. And again, it comes back to Ian Armitt's diagram of overlapping, where the Souterrain campaign camps, these are not forts, these are campaign camps. There's only Carpoo here and Cramond that appear to be permanently occupied. So I think it's unlikely that the Souterrains are doing business with the locals. They're probably taking a lot of material and potentially enslaving a lot of the young men as well, and conscripting. I mentioned plague and loss of trade. The Antonine withdrawal is real. I'm not entirely convinced with the date of 165. A lot of the material from the Antonine wall would quite comfortably take it through to the 180s, which is when we know Newstead was abandoned. Our recent work at Newstead has shown that the coins there are current up to about the late 170s. So the Antonine wall, I suspect, there's only 117 coins from the Antonine wall to make any assessment on dating. And I suspect that the Antonine withdrawal was probably a bit later, round about the 180s at the time of the Commodore disaster. But that withdrawal would certainly have stopped material culture and investment, not direct investment, but indirect investment through the needs of the Roman army. And then, as I said earlier, I think the loss of use of the Souterrains is a combined effect, probably warfare, because we can't get away from the fact that there was definitely recorded warfare at the time, possibly disease, but also the locals starting to use different practices for their storage of surplus, and perhaps copying some of the practices that were being used in East Lothian. And any of you that have been to Galicia will have seen these. They leave virtually no archaeological footprint. They're all over the place. They're about 1,500 years old, some of the older ones. And these are the horios, the grain stores that are elevated on either wooden or stone legs. And you can see that if the storage capacities, the storage function of the indigenous people could have shifted from an underground to an overground storage phenomenon. Now, there have been 2 or 3 relatively recent excavations that have looked at, very carefully looked at the infill of the Souterrains, and also looked at the relationship of adjacent structures. You can see here at Newmill, there's a roundhouse, again, almost connected to the tail of this particular Souterrain. But one of the most exacting excavations that has been done is this one at Ardowney. Is anybody here? Was anybody here involved in Ardowney? No. Ardowney was, in my view, probably the most well-studied Souterrain in the last 20 years, simply because of the ancillary post-excavation work that was done on the Souterrain. It was being encroached on by the line of the A92, and the road was being widened and moved, and these 2 Souterrains had been picked up by aerial photography from crop marks, and Souterrains come up well on good crop marks because the inner fill is usually quite moist and you get good differential growth over the souterrain. But unexpectedly, they cut through this one because it wasn't on the aerial photograph. So what they realised is that there's probably, even the aerial photography of souterrains grossly underestimates the number of souterrains that are out there. So they decided to do a rescue excavation on this particular souterrain. It's a double souterrain, and you can see the classic corbelling coming into the capstones here. This nice bulbous end. Some souterrains are paved, other souterrains are not. There doesn't seem to be a rhyme or reason to the ones that are paved, and the material that's found in them doesn't seem to connect either to whether they're paved or not. But this souterrain underwent intense analysis for the presence of animals, for the presence of grains, pollen and so on. And also the infill was excavated in tiny detail. And what they concluded was that in fact this souterrain hadn't been infilled in one event. It had been partially de-roofed and then had started filling in itself and then had been reoccupied a bit later. And there's now a suggestion that there's an 8th or 9th century reoccupation of some of these sites, although that's relatively tenuous at the moment. But they concluded that they couldn't support the souterrain abandonment horizon of Armit, because this souterrain was definitely in use during the Roman period. There are one or two small Roman sherds from it. And the other big thing that's become apparent over the last 20 years is that we have only seen the stone souterrains. There are now probably an equal number of wooden souterrains out there that don't have any stonework in them at all. They would have had wooden posts, sides, and would have been wooden timber and turf roofs. And more of these have become apparent. So I've listed the ones that we know have got a significant wooden superstructure in our current knowledge. And you can see the posts there, and the Dupton Farm one, it's quite close to Brechin. And there would have been wooden over rafters with probably a turf roof. It was Headland Archaeology excavated Dupton. And then there's this one, which is absolutely fascinating. There is what appears to be a wood-lined souterrain, but actually within the circuit of a roundhouse, and they were fairly sure they were contemporaneous with each other. You can see the main post ring of the roundhouse, and the souterrain curves around under, if you like, under the eaves of the roundhouse. And that would have been the shelter area of the roundhouse. And with the main entrance of the roundhouse at the front there, and then the entrance to the souterrain there. And this strange tunnel coming through from a drainage ditch. And they believed that part of the souterrain was being used as a water tank that was being fed from outside the roundhouse. So clearly souterrains, one purpose, one size, doesn't fit all for their uses. And then, if I just conclude now with brief discussion of the southern souterrains, one of the issues from our point of view at Trimontium about these southern souterrains is that there is quite evidently a relationship with the departure of the Romans. This is Castle Law, which is in the Pentlands. The souterrain here has been inserted into the ditch of the disused ditch of the hill fort. And it's quite spectacular in terms of length. It's been partially reconstructed by the Department of Works back in the 70s and 80s. It's got a concrete roof. So you can see how relatively narrow it is, and trying to get a cow down that would not have been particularly easy. So that's Castle Law. There's Crichton Souterrain, which is quite close to us. And Crichton Souterrain has got diamond broaching stonework in it. This is almost certainly Roman, and it has a carved Pegasus in the roof. Pegasus being the emblem of the Second Augustan Legion, and it's believed, it's strongly suspected that there's a missing fort. There's a gap in the distance between Trimontium and Inveresk, and there needs to be a fort somewhere at Pathhead, and we think this is material that's being reused. So clearly these souterrains have been built after the Romans have left, and they're not getting this stonework while the Romans are around. And then there's the curious case of Shirva. Most of you will know about this, but Shirva is a farm that's halfway between the Roman fort at Auchendavy and Bar Hill. And when they were surveying for the Forth and Clyde Canal, you can see the canal runs through the Antonine ditch. When they were cutting through there, they cut through a souterrain. And the souterrain's roof was made out of Roman gravestones. And it was made out of not only the standard Roman gravestone, but these sepulchral carvings of a prone dead Roman. So there are probably about 5 or 6 gravestones have been reused for that particular souterrain. So again, the Romans are gone by this point because these are all Antonine period gravestones. And finally, this is Kirsty Lilly, who works with us. She's an archaeologist who's been helping out at the Trust over the last year. And she's got a big interest in Neolithic rock art. And this is the doorway in to the souterrain at Teeling, which is just a couple of miles from here. And you can see quite clearly a nice cup and ring marked rock there. And the top left-hand one is from Pitcairn, and the bottom one is from Riven, which is Roddy's souterrain. It's in Roddy's garden. And I'm grateful to Roddy for sending me this because I hadn't been able to find this particular paper. And these are the carvings that are in the roof of the Riven souterrain, and they're still there. So obviously they were held in some esteem, not necessarily a religious connotation, but certainly the masons who were building the souterrains understood that these were some sort of religious carving that are 1,000 years older than the actual structure of the souterrain. And there's probably, I think, 5 or 6 souterrains now have cup and ring marked carvings within them that have been reused for part of the structure. So, what are my conclusions? Well, souterrains are not uniquely Scottish, unlike Brochs, but the Angus souterrains are a definite subtype. They're bigger, taller, longer, and probably better constructed than most of the other souterrain groups. Wooden souterrains are now in the ascendancy archaeologically because we're starting to excavate crop marks, and these crop marks don't contain stonework. They're much commoner and previously recognised. As I say, there are now literally hundreds have been identified. Likely for surplus food, and my guess is meat and dairy products over grain, but I think grain probably still in there as a possibility. And nobody can quite agree on the abandonment horizon. It's still an ongoing argument with its various proponents. But I think the impact of Rome can't be ignored. It definitely has to have had something to do with it, either through desertion of the landscape or direct destruction. And then the others will have simply decayed as the trends in food storage, the technology in food storage developed and evolved. So, thank you for your time. We're running a course, Romans in Scotland course, starts on the 6th of January. If anybody's interested, it's a 12-week course. And just in case anybody wants late Christmas present, alongside God's Eagle Mare, discounted to £15. Thank you very much.